I came out a year ago with my prediction that Trump would lose the 2020 election. Yesterday, I was asked how I came to that conclusion using the ancient art of astrology, so let me tell the story. I cast the election day chart for 2020 for the first time roughly a year ago because so many of my clients were going through some angst as Trump's presidency unfolded. The point was to plug the transits into Donald Trump's natal chart. As soon as I saw the transits for Election Day and Inauguration Day, I was able to inform my clients that there was no way Donald Trump could pull out a win with what the planets were reflecting. The energy of the planets, in other words, would very likely not bring him a positive result. Are you sure? They'd asked. How do you know? To understand Election Day 2020, we have to go back 20 years to the events of 9/11. I think everyone has a flashbulb memory of that day. I myself was a school teacher. I was in my classroom and my department chair came in saying that there'd been a terrorist attack in New York City. A plane had hit the World Trade Center. We wheeled a television into the room and we watched as the horrors unfolded. Nobody was able to work anyway because parents kept coming to pick up their children, and the loudspeaker was nonstop announcing names to come down to the office. When I got home, I went to my desktop and looked up the chart for New York City. Some of you might be thinking, New York City has a chart? In mundane astrology, there are charts for countries and cities and companies and events. These charts give characteristics of an entity, and event charts characterize moments in time. New York has a chart, and the event itself has a chart. Flight 11 and Flight 77 hitting the towers and the towers collapsing can be taken as a whole, or each event can have its own chart. But since everything happened pretty close together, the event charts with each new development would be similar. A Pluto-Saturn opposition was going on by transit on September 11th. Pluto was in Sagittarius and Saturn was in Gemini, opposite each other in the wheel. Within the chart of New York, there was another Pluto-Saturn opposition. This one occurred at its inception on January 1st of 1898. Back then, Pluto was in Gemini and Saturn was in Sag. So during the events of 9/11, New York City had in its chart a reverse transit. Transiting Saturn was sitting on New York's natal Pluto, and Pluto was sitting on New York's natal Saturn. In essence, what you had on September 11th was a Pluto-Saturn opposition transiting in the sky, sitting on the Pluto-Saturn opposition in New York's natal wheel. Why were these two Pluto-Saturn oppositions on top of each other so important to 9/11? Well, they tell you what the event was really about. Pluto-Saturn oppositions bring a loss of status. Two of them in the same place told me to look at the collapse of the towers as a collapse of status. When Pluto and Saturn are both in opposition and conjunction, we see a time of reckoning when the laws of cause and effect are amplified. And reckonings often contain a reversal of fortune, not always, but often. The attack was an attempt to humiliate the United States, to take away its greatest status symbol. The towers were, the chart said, a hood ornament on the vehicle of Western wealth and power. Now, back to Donald Trump's wheel. A year ago, when I looked at the chart for the election and Inauguration Day as well, I found something interesting. Two Pluto-Saturn oppositions again. On Election Day, transiting Pluto in Cap would be opposing his natal Saturn in Cancer. Now fast forward to the inauguration in January, and the second would be within orb again, only this time transiting Saturn would move into Aquarius and oppose his natal Pluto in Leo. At that point, I remembered an image from the past. In 2016, when the election was between Hillary and Trump, Hillary expected to win, and so she rented an enormous venue with a glass ceiling. Not expecting to win, Trump was in a small place a few blocks away. All were waiting for the returns, and New York City had a plan, which was to project the image of the winner on the side of what I think was the Empire State Building. When the election was called, up came the image of Trump in lights on the skyscraper. I remembered that when I saw his election chart, I thought, that tower is falling. Two Pluto-Saturn oppositions, yes, symbolically, his tower will collapse. But I was puzzled as to how that would occur. When I cast the chart in December of 2019, Trump was in good shape. And it looked from the outside that he would probably sail to re-election. I couldn't imagine what was going to take him down in the span of 11 months. The truth is, he'd been lucky. He started with a good economy, and there had been no major events that he had to deal with. And there were no terrorist attacks, no financial collapse that could be felt across the nation. He'd been experiencing a really smooth ride, and of course, he had a media machine that kept a good narrative going for him. Trump was immune to all the scandals that would have brought any public official down when I was a kid. But the damage had already begun by the time I cast that chart. COVID had made it to the shores of America. It just wasn't widely known at the time. I firmly believe that Trump could have won a lot of support during COVID. If he had been the populist he pretended to be 5 years ago, he could have worked these oppositions to his favor. All he would have had to have done is implemented a legit pandemic response and cut some checks to the people. But Pluto represents power, and Saturn represents responsibility. When this opposition takes you down, it's because of a misuse of power and the lack of a normal response. In other words, it's because the dark sides of both of the planets come out. For the native, a Pluto-Saturn opposition usually involves humiliation and embarrassment. You might think, well, he got a term he wasn't expecting. It's probably time for him to go back to the golf course and retire quietly. No. When transits are going on in an individual chart, you have to think about how the native is experiencing the transit on a personal level. You have to ask how it feels to the native, not how it looks from the outside. Any incumbent president being thrown out is an embarrassment. It means that despite all the powers of the presidency, all the infrastructure and money and influence, all the trappings of that office weren't enough to overcome a challenger. There's something particularly shameful to Trump about being usurped by such a vacuous candidate. Biden's platform was, I'll wear a mask and I won't tweet wild conspiracy claims in the middle of the night. Government is supposed to run quietly in the background, not be in your face 24/7. After Trump's administration, sleepy, quiet Joe was sounding just fine to the majority. My opinion is that neither of these men belongs near public office, though I did cast a vote for what I considered the lesser of the evils. And I did win a juicy, exotic bet about which states would go which way. But let's face it, most Americans would have voted for that fly if it had been on the ballot. I'm 50, and so I remember a time when the bar wasn't this low. It is so very, very low now. A limbo champion couldn't wiggle under it. In astrology, prediction means you take the evidence of the transits, you mix it with experience that you've had in the past, and you throw in some intuition about how you think something will go. Let's continue with the personal experience that Trump is probably going to have with these two oppositions in his natal chart. We get some indication by the location of the oppositions. Both span the 5th, 11th house axis. What do these houses have to do with? Well, the 5th oversees our sense of specialness, and the 11th oversees our social network, our social allies, and our web. So those things will be central in the fall of Trump's tower. I think the story there is going to be that he finds much less support for his post-election antics than he believed he would within his political network. Since Venus is sandwiched between the Pluto-Saturn oppositions, I think he's going to find out that his loyalists aren't as loyal as he thought. The people who have been fluffing him for the past 4 years will move on and fluff the next guy. Any feelings of specialness that he may have had in his network are going to fall to the wayside. And this is where he, I think, is really going to take a hit emotionally. Narcissists experience something called narcissistic wounding. It won't feel good when Biden supporters drive by Trump towers, beeping their horns, sticking their middle fingers up, holding signs that say, "You're fired." But a lot of the embarrassment associated with these transits is likely to come from Donald Trump's own behavior as he reacts to his loss. As of this recording, he's filing lawsuits, claiming false victory, desperately sowing doubt, and even making up conditions for a peaceful transfer of power. Okay, how about this for a peaceful transfer? You get the fuck out. Now, how will any of his attempts work? For that, we can look to another transit. Transits are experienced collectively as well as individually in a natal chart. Their placements correspond to events, yes, but also to the character of a moment or the character of an era. Because we're talking about the ways of government and the establishment, because we're talking about procedures and law and the oldest ways of our government institutions, we look to what the planet Saturn is doing, because all of those things are under Saturn's purview. Now, Saturn's been moving in and out of Capricorn for months, and it's almost gone for good, meaning that it won't be back for another 28 years. Saturn will be at 29.5 degrees of Capricorn when the Electoral College meets on December 16, 2020, which suggests that it will be business as usual and a dramatic revolutionary coup or takeover is unlikely. Trump's threats to install an alternative slate of electors won't go anywhere. Instead, Saturn in Cap will bring us back as before. Basically, the planet is saying that most of what we're hearing now is noise. The electors look like they're going to do their jobs in the end. However, soon after, a shift will occur. On December 18th, just 2 days after the electoral vote, Saturn finally moves out of Capricorn and it begins a 2.5-year trek through Aquarius. This is where I, as an astrologer, see a change coming because Saturn in Aquarius by transit is often collectively expressed as civil unrest. We have seen some unrest in recent years. That's been a byproduct of failing trust in our institutions and a growing resentment over power and wealth being in the hands of so few on the backs of so many. The unrest that's on the way, the seeds of which will be sown in December, will have a different tone. I expect it to be more radical, and that's for 2 reasons. One is that Saturn is moving into an ideological extremist sign. The other factor is that as soon as Saturn ingresses into Aquarius, Jupiter moves there too, and both will be traveling together. Jupiter acts as an accelerant no matter what it touches. So, what'll happen? Astrological predictions require context always. So let's look at the context. We're already in a time of high tensions as the US heads toward its first Pluto return. Then Jupiter and Saturn move into Aquarius. The timing of this move occurs just after the results of an election are made final. Sometimes unrest comes from truly unexpected sources. The spark that lights such things can be difficult to predict, but look at the conditions around us. We have something now that we didn't have before November 3rd, and that is disgruntled Trump fans, many of whom believe that the election was stolen, that they were robbed. As Trump flails and claims election fraud, his words and recordings of people parroting those words are being disseminated by right-wing media like a virus moving in aerosol form. Many Trump fans are actually in love with Trump, and they have an almost cult-like bias. We won't even cover the conspiracy theorists of QAnon who have wrapped every normal conspiracy theory up together with Trump as a savior in the center. These people think he's a kind of superhero who must stay in power or child molesters will take over the world. It gets pretty unhinged as you go deeper into the conspiracy matrix. Saturn in Aquarius will also be expressing itself in a pandemic landscape of unemployment and poverty and mass eviction. There are hundreds of millions of firearms spread out across the country, too. I have to admit, all the ingredients are present from mid-December onwards for a heck of a period of unrest. I'm suspicious of the social disruption associated with a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. One of the things this conjunction tells us is to have a purpose. A higher purpose, all the better. The beauty of astrology is that you know what the energy is, but you can't say exactly how it will materialize. My favorite part is witnessing a planetary energy take shape and be born on the material plane. I think the greatest takeaway from the election, at least for me, is that even though the Electoral College might look like a definitive win on paper at the end, the popular vote win is going to be small, and many of the swing states were razor thin again. I know some were hoping for a house cleaning, a tidal wave against the incumbent, a repudiation of the past few years, but that didn't happen. As a country, we're extraordinarily polarized. The two sides live in almost different universes, and neither group is going away. Lately, I've heard people saying that they're worried about civil war. What do the planets have to say? Well, for that, we have to ask Neptune, the watery god of paradox and polarization. Neptune is currently in the same position it was during the lead up to the Civil War, and that's worth some exploration. So that's what I'll do in my next talk. For now, thank you for listening to Secrets from an Astrologer's Desk. I'm Joy. More to come.